Good morning, who's everybody who's watching on YouTube. So glad to have you here. Sorry, just starting a few minutes behind today. As we're going to study a little bit of Savannah history, as was asked. We'll probably do this session again another time for people. And we got Bubba online, hopefully, and Bubba is more knowledgeable than me. And he is a local whose uncle was the longest serving rabbi in our congregation's history, serving over 40 years. So pretty impressive. So hope everybody's doing well. Hope you guys had a good Passover. Thanks for understanding last week because of the holiday we didn't have class. And looking forward to having class today. We will be having class in person in Sun City next month. Next week we'll have class. The week after we won't because I'll be out of town. So good morning again to Bubba's trying to get on. We'll wait for him to see if he can get connect. And I know a lot of people are not here today because there is a session on the Jews of the South at Ollie. So I was debating whether we should have class today, but I said, why not? Not everybody's going to that. So good morning. So for those of you who are new to Savannah history, it is one of the stalwarts of our congregation because our history is like few others. It is an incredible string of events that continue to this day. We are the third oldest congregation in America. We're the first in the South. We're the first Ashkenazic congregation, even though we were started both as a Sephardic and Ashkenazic, but we were the only Ashkenazic congregation in America for about 60 plus years. We're the second oldest house of worship in Georgia after Christ Church. And it's really an incredible belief, the idea that we've had this congregation continually since 1733, although Charleston's congregation, KKBE, says they're the oldest in continuous use, but obviously they're wrong. It's us. So how did it all start? And we've got Bubba here. Hopefully he'll come in a bit and help out. It's a really interesting story. It starts not in the usual place, but in Portugal. And there's actually going to be a mini-series documentary. What do you call it, Genevieve? A documentary mini-series? Is there a docu-series?
Yeah, docu-series.
That's being made about the history of of the Jews of Georgia. It was going to be a documentary, and then during the pandemic, they decided to move it to a mini-series, and hopefully they'll get the funding for that. So it doesn't begin in the usual places. It begins in Portugal, where a very prominent physician, whose name would become Samuel Nunes, is the physician for the Grand Inquisitor of Portugal. So he's a very prominent physician. His nephew will become the physician to Catherine the Great. So a very prominent family. He treated the King of Portugal as well. And there's a lot of jealousy at court. And there's at least some suspicion. So a rival gets a servant spy to work for Nunes, and they catch him being Jewish. So he's a converso, a Jew who's pretending to be Christian. Now remember, Jews were kicked out of Portugal in 1496, I believe, for 4 years after they were kicked out of Spain. So 1720s from 1496. So it is a very long time. It's over 200 years since Jews were kicked out of Portugal. So for the family to have some sort of sense of Judaism after a couple hundred years, they found out later, is pretty impressive. But they get caught. He is not killed, probably because he's connected and he's useful. And then one day he goes out with some friends onto a boat. He's invited by a captain to go out for a little leisurely tour on his boat. They bring their picnic baskets on the boat and they go to England and leave everything behind. And they get to England, and for years there, they don't fit in. The English congregation is also Sephardic, but these people come to speak a different language. They don't have any money. They're probably not socially fitting in. And so the congregation, Bevis Marks, which is the oldest congregation in England, sponsors them on a trip to America along with two German families who probably the same thing, who came to England and fit in. And, you go to the New World. Why? Not because you're super successful and happy. You go to the New World because you want to become super successful. And they arrive here on July 11th of 1733. Now, the colony had been founded in February of that same year. So Oglethorpe found Savannah in February of 1733. The boat with the Jews actually left before the Oglethorpe boat, but they had a lot of problems and ran aground and issues. And so they actually arrived here 5 months later or 6 months later. And this colony was founded as a debtor's colony. So some people compare it to Australia, but it's not like Australia at all. Australia was a colony for criminals, sometimes hardened criminals. The criminals who were coming to Georgia were people who owed money. And in some cases, not very much, and you could be in prison for a long time owing a small amount. And so they arrive here looking for a new life. There's also a lot of people came to Georgia as indentured servants. Some were treated well, some were not. So they start the colony here. They meet the Native Americans, they're starting the colony, and all of a sudden a plague, some sort of epidemic hits. We actually had a scholar who was just here who spoke about how he believes it was influenza, so it was the flu. Some people thought yellow fever, that was recently debunked in recent years. So he thinks it was influenza. And so all of a sudden this boat of Jews arrives with 41 Jews, and they are given full rights in this colony, which had never happened before. There had never been a group of Jews this large come to America before. There had only been one boat of Jews really had come to America, and that had been about 80 years ago. And that was because the Jews were kicked out of Brazil. Brazil had been controlled by the Dutch, and then the Portuguese took it back. And so all the Jews were kicked out. So the Jews were going back to Europe. One ship ended up in New Amsterdam and stayed. So except for that boat, which didn't have as many Jews as this boat, there really hadn't been a Jewish boat that had come. There had been Jews coming individually, mostly as adventurers or traders or business people. But they were given full rights for a couple of reasons. And if one of them was Oglethorpe created the colony kind of in a utopian fashion. So there was only a few groups of people who were not allowed to come on to this colony. Those, first of all, was Catholics, Papists. Papists were not allowed because obviously Georgia was created to protect Charleston from Spanish Florida. And Spain, I believe, controlled all the way up to what is New Brunswick, St. Simons today. Number two, no alcohol dealers, no slave owners. And lastly, no lawyers. The worst of the worst. No lawyers allowed in Savannah. So I don't think the charter specifically said no Jews, although somebody said that recently it may have. It definitely was assumed that Jews were not allowed to come here, but it didn't say officially. So by the time the backers of the colony sent word to Oglethorpe, don't let the Jews stay, it was already too late. The Jews were here. And he'd already given them the same thing as everybody else. He gave them a house, a garden, a plot, and then a farmland, and they were required to serve in the military and the militia. It's only the second time Jews were allowed to serve in the militia. The first time, one of the people that on that boat that went to New Amsterdam petitioned and against the governor's wishes and was finally allowed to be in the militia. This time they were required to be in the militia to protect Charleston from Spain. And then the other reason, obviously, that they were allowed to stay is because Samuel Nunez treated the colony and saved them from this epidemic because the doctor had been killed. And so Jews all of a sudden are integrated into this colony, and they represent a very big percentage because there's, I think, under 200 people left after the epidemic. And then all of a sudden you get 41 Jews. So 41 out of 250, roughly. And you can see that's a very high percentage of Jews. We're talking about, 18% or some ridiculous number. And then 4 years later, there's going to be more Jews who come because Bevis Marks backs another expedition of German Jews. So we will be the largest Jewish community in America for all of 5 years. But we held the title, you know. So they come here and they're integrated and welcomed pretty completely. Almost every organization in our city had some Jew or mini Jews on the original boards, the founding boards. So everything from the Masons to the Rotary to the benevolent societies to starting orphanage, usually had members of the Jewish community on the opening board. Not only were Jews given full rights and the same thing as everybody else, but there was no restrictions on them increasing their wealth. So if you were entrepreneurial or skilled, you could increase your wealth through a wide range of ways, from trading to farming to distilleries, which became a very big Jewish enterprise in America, as it had been in Europe, as Bubba can tell us about. And so it became a very open place for people who were Jewish. Years later, of course, Catholics would be allowed to come in. Slavery was allowed, I think, in the 1750s, but really didn't become a major factor in Georgia until the cotton gin had been discovered, invented, which was invented outside of Savannah, if you didn't know. So once the cotton gin was invented, the slavery really increased in its need. So now, which of those rules evaporated firstly? And it was alcohol. Alcohol soon after had to be served because no ship would land in a port without alcohol. Because the captains of the ship knew there would be some sort of rebellion from the sailors, because that's what they did. They went to the bars and drank and had merriment, and they spent their money on alcohol. So if you went to a place where they didn't have alcohol, the sailors were not happy about it. And that would go across from pirates to people in the military. And so alcohol became part of this. In fact, Abigail Minus, who's probably our most famous congregant, probably one of the most important, if not the most important Jewish woman of the 18th century. She was early proponent, I believe, of alcohol and owned a bar. And so the Jewish community thrived, although there were several issues. The first and major issue was, obviously, you have Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews in one place, which is probably fine for short term, but is problematic in the long term because there are a lot of different viewpoints. In fact, some of the non-Jews in the community wrote in their diaries how the Jews were always fighting over. Can anybody guess what they were always fighting over? Food. What food they could eat. And as we know from Passover, Sephardic Jews look at Passover very differently than Ashkenazic Jews. There's probably different ways of keeping kosher. Some were probably doing it, some weren't. And so also some of the prayers are different, the traditions. So even though there was one Jewish congregation, Mikveh Israel, there was a lot of probably contention, but it didn't last very long. Because in 1742, which is only 9 years after we arrived, there was a war between Spain and England. So it was called the War of Jenkins' Ear. Jenkins got his ear taken off, the war starts. And although I heard recently that perhaps 2 Portuguese Jews stayed, I'll have to look that up, that actually maybe Nunez's son stayed or came back, the Portuguese Jews left. Why did the Portuguese Jews leave? Because, remember, Spain was pretty much in control or hovered over Portugal, and they both had the Inquisition. The Portuguese Jews in Savannah had left illegally from Portugal. So they were still considered criminals in Portugal. So the belief was, if Spain took Savannah, the Ashkenazic Jews, they would be, the militiamen would be in prison, then they'd be freed and everything would be fine. However, the Sephardic Jews who illegally left would be arrested along with their families and might even face death. So if you were a Portuguese family, you feared the Spain coming in, taking over, and then you going to the gallows. So most of the Portuguese, if not all, left. Some went to Richmond, some went to Philadelphia, where they helped to found Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, which is the fourth oldest synagogue in America. And so we would become, for the most part, an Ashkenazic synagogue, although Sephardic Jews would come in throughout the years. So we would be the only Ashkenazic synagogue in America from 1733 till the 1790s, when an Ashkenazic synagogue opened up in Philadelphia. So most of the Jews, especially up until the 1750s and 60s, that came to the Americas were Sephardic Jews. And I can talk about the reasons for that. Basically, the reasons were Ashkenazic Jews kind of lived in bubbles where they were kind of ostracized, where Portuguese and Sephardic Jews lived in the world. So they were more knowledgeable about the world. So Jews live in this community from 1733 and successfully all the way into, of course, the 1770s, where obviously by the 1760s there is dissension as we have two major groups align in America, and that's the groups that support Britain and the people who don't, Patriots, the Tories, and most of the Jews support the Patriots. So most of them are supporting, at first, obviously not separation, but supporting rights for the people here, which shows how integrated they were if they felt comfortable enough to protest England. In fact, the head of the Jewish delegation here, Mordechai Sheftel, was considered the rabble-rousing Jewish leader of Savannah by the governor of Georgia. Now, it's interesting that Mordechai Sheftel and another guy named Minus, they were the first two non-Native Americans born in Georgia. So the first two non-Native Americans born in Georgia were both Jewish. And so when the war came out, Mordechai Sheftel and his son and most of the Jews support the Patriots, and they go into battle. Mordechai Sheftel becomes an on-field general and the highest ranking Jew in the military during the Revolution. He and his son are captured at the Battle of Savannah, but before the Battle of Savannah, he was actually the person in charge of sending our delegate to the Second Continental Congress. That's where they signed the Declaration of Independence, but nobody knew it was going to be a big deal. I imagine if he had known it was going to be a big deal, he might have done it himself. He could have been a Jewish guy signing it, because it was considered a secondary position. In fact, the gentleman who was given that position was a man named Bud Gwinnett. If you guys ever been on Gwinnett Street, Bud Gwinnett and a guy named McIntosh hated each other and both wanted to be the generals in charge of the defense of Savannah. And McIntosh is given it. Gwinnett is given this silly position where he has to go to sign this stupid piece of paper. He comes back, he's really upset. He runs for office with the Patriots. He wins. He becomes in charge of basically the Georgia. He sends McIntosh on a mission. He knows McIntosh is going to lose. McIntosh comes back and challenges him to a duel. They duel in the dueling grounds here in downtown. Both of them are hit. McIntosh survives, and Gwinnett dies from his injuries because of an infection. And because of that, Bud Gwinnett's signature is the most valuable signature of anybody who signed the Declaration of Independence, because he died soon afterwards and didn't sign anything. So his signature is worth way more than, for instance, George Washington. So that was, and in fact, it was a trivia question on Jeopardy. Somebody sent it to me who had heard that spiel. So Mordechai Sheftel, though, and most of the Jews of Savannah leave when obviously it looks like the city is going to be captured. Mordechai Sheftel and his son Sheftel were in the forces. In the papers of the Patriots, it actually says basically we're going to retreat to the Jewish cemetery. So the cemetery we still are in control of from one of the Sheftel families is where they retreated to when the first lines fell. And then all the rest of them, everybody eventually swam across the river to escape into to South Carolina. except Mordechai Sheftel, and Sheftel did not escape across the river. Does anybody know why? It's ironic, because Sheftel did not know how to swim. And so because Sheftel, his 17-year-old son, didn't know how to swim, Mordechai stayed back, and they both were captured and treated very poorly. It's really an irony because Mordechai Sheftel was a very religious Jew. And according to the Talmud, there are only a few things you're required to teach your children. Basically, obviously, Torah to be a good person, but you're required to teach them a trade, to help them find a spouse, and to swim. It actually says in the Talmud, you're supposed to teach him to swim. Sheftel didn't learn. He was probably autistic. That may be one of the reasons. So Mordechai Sheftel spent the rest of the war on prison ships. And they were actually on the prison ships even after the war until they're finally released. They are treated very poorly on the prison ships. There is a friend of his who was on the prison ship, was a minister. And the minister made an escape attempt and drowned during the escape attempt. So what happened was the minister made it to the beach, and then somebody was drowning. He went out to save the drowning guy, but then he died. But his diary was found and given to the family, and it was like in the family for generations. They didn't know what it was. And then about 6 years ago, it was found like in an attic in the family and published. And in it, he talked about his friendship with this gentleman who was Jewish. And Mordechai Sheftel actually was offered to give the last of his money for the funeral for this minister, but it was refused. But the minister talked about how poorly his friend, the Jew, was being treated. They would dip his utensils in lard, pig lard, before giving it to him to eat, because they knew he couldn't eat that kind of food. So he was roughed up and treated very much worse than all the other officers who were captured. But in the end, most of the Jews support the revolution, and obviously, if you didn't know, we won. It was a stunning upset. And so Jewish life continued here. People like Mordechai Sheftel, Abigail Minus, helped to fund the revolution. There's a gentleman named Chaim Solomon who's very famous because he contributed the most money of anybody to the revolution. He ended up bankrupt, died destitute. Mordechai Sheftel ended up bankrupt, but he was a little younger, so he ended up in Philadelphia, and then he made his way back to Savannah and was able to find employment and become respectable, but never nearly as wealthy as he was. Abigail Minus was smart enough not to give all of her wealth to the revolution, and she stayed very wealthy and one of the wealthiest women in America for a very long time. If you come to archives, there's also a ketubah from her family and his family that married one of the oldest ketubahs, because there wasn't very many documentation. Now, when it comes to the religion here, you have to remember there were no rabbis in America until the 1840s. They call those the good old days. See if you guys get that joke. Okay, I use that. That usually kills when I do a tour. So you can understand why. I mean, this is the Wild West. Rabbis to come out here where there's really no connection. There's nowhere to get kosher food. There's, how are you going to find work? And there's one rabbi who came to America and spoke at, I believe, Touro in the 1880s. Touro is the second oldest congregation in America. It is in Rhode Island. And there's people who wrote about how brilliantly and how amazing an orator this guy was. This rabbi spoke for 2 hours, and everybody was enthralled. And of course, there's comments afterwards. Everybody was enthralled, even though they didn't understand a single word, because he was speaking a language they didn't understand. So he came to the synagogue. He spoke for 2 hours, probably in something like Ladino, which nobody understood anymore. And that was the only rabbi I think we have a record of coming to America in the 18th century. So when you had services, and there were 5 congregations in America by the time of the revolution, a 6th congregation just started during before Washington was elected. Actually, the executive director of that Richmond congregation was just here last week visiting, or maybe even 2 days ago. Last Friday, I think, visited. And so you would have lay leaders. So you had people like Mordechai Sheftel, who would be a lay leader, Jake LaMotta later on, Jake de LaMotta, not the fighter. They did not have a building here in Savannah. They either used homes or rented spaces. So we wouldn't have our first building until 1820. And that first building was built on what is now the parking lot of the Soho Grill on Liberty Street. When they did arrive in 1733, does anybody know what the first thing you're supposed to do as a Jewish community when you start a congregation? The first thing you do is start a cemetery society and make a cemetery. So the first cemetery was built on what is now Bull Street and Oglethorpe. So just a few blocks out of town. Obviously, as the town grew, it went over the cemetery. They never moved the bodies. They're still there. There is a marker there with the names of the people we know are there. So when that happened, eventually Mordechai Sheftel's sons built 2 cemeteries. Actually, Mordechai may have done it. Mordechai and maybe his Bubba, it's Mordechai and his half brother, or was it? I forget now. Anyway, 2 Sheftels built, Levi Sheftel and I think Mordechai, I think it was he and his half brother, built 2 cemeteries that we are still in charge of. One was for the Sheftel family. One was for anybody else who was Jewish who died. So if you were Jewish in Georgia and you died, you may have been buried in this cemetery. We may not have records of it. There was an officer, they were trying to find, put up a marker in the cemetery because they thought he was buried there, but we couldn't prove it. We couldn't find anything saying he had been. Those 2 cemeteries are now closed. In the 19th century, the city of Savannah built 2 large cemeteries, Laurel Grove and Bonaventure, and invited the Jewish communities. At that time was just Mikveh Israel, later BBJ, and then for Bonaventure later AA to have their own sections. So all 3 congregations have their section of Bonaventure. We have sections at Laurel Grove. Lower Grove is closed unless you have a section already. Bonaventure is still open as it's a bigger space. And so these 2 became the 2 cemeteries for the Jewish community. If you go to Bonaventure, which is the famous one, obviously, but you can go to Laurel Grove, which is really probably even in many ways more interesting because it's not as well kept. It's not a kept cemetery as much. They have a Civil War section. They have a Jewish section. So I think I've only done 2 funerals there. So I did one for David Bick, I think is buried there. Not David Bick, maybe Philip Solomons may be buried there. I think Philip Solomons is buried there, or maybe
David Bick is buried there.
David Bick Sr.
Yeah, and Sylvan Bick is buried there also.
Whose funeral did I do there? It wasn't Phil. It was yeah, I think David Bick I did there. The David Bick Sr., not David Bick, the one we all knew here. So those continue to be the cemeteries for a long time. Laurel Grove closed. Bonaventure is now the Jewish cemetery, although not everybody's buried there, but there is an enormous Jewish section. If you go there, it's incredible to see how big this Jewish section is. It stretches over a very large, there's even some mausoleums there. There's private sections. If you're in our section for Mikveh Israel, you have to keep a flat memorial stone unless you buy 6 graves, and then you can put 1 that stands up. But there's actually no rule for how you put a memorial stone, up, down, what's on it. There are no rules. So it really becomes whatever the tradition is. And so throughout the end of the 18th century, Jews continue to prosper in Savannah. And it continues to be a place where Jews have a lot of rights. We're going to always have rights in Georgia. It'll be one of the few, it's maybe the only one of the 13 colonies that Jews have always had full rights. There are debates because maybe, which is the one, Pennsylvania, I think may have done it as well. One of the other colonies may have been given full rights, not Rhode Island, which is the one that was started by the Quaker that give rights. I forgot which one, but for sure we did. But there may be one other colony.
Pennsylvania didn't give, that was started by the Quakers, and that was not full rights.
Okay, which one is it? It's not, who was the guy, the one guy who started by himself and started the colony?
Rhode Island.
Yeah, but maybe Rhode Island. Maybe Rhode Island also gave full rights. I'm not sure. But I always thought it was just us. But somebody came up to me and said, no, their state did the same thing. But I don't remember. So they're probably wrong. So Jews continued to prosper and thrive here, doing a variety of businesses. Now, our congregational never reached the level it had before as the largest congregation in America, but funny enough, most people don't realize that Charleston was the largest Jewish city in America from probably around 1742 to the 1840s. So maybe 100 years, Charleston was the largest Jewish place in America until New York would take it over. So there are more Jews in Charleston than New York as early as 1845, as late 1845, really. So basically, by the late 18th century and then the 19th century, most of the immigrants now coming to America are German Jews. Most of them are Ashkenazic Jews. And so what you'll see is different group of people coming to America who are less religious generally than the Sephardic Jews. They are now coming from Europe where Jews are allowed to be more educated. So the Ashkenazic Jews that are coming over in the 19th century are a little bit different often because of what Napoleon did. Napoleon freed up Europe in many respects for Jews so they could go into different fields. So you'd have Jews coming 1820s, and then 1840s, the larger German immigration to America really started, and you would have Jews coming into. So a lot of the Jews in our congregation who've been here a long time will come from this German immigration. There are very few Jews here in our congregation from the 18th century. There's only a couple from the Mordechai Sheftel family. There are still Sheftels and Minuses in Savannah. Not all of them are Jewish. We do have Sheftel descendants in our congregation, and they're the only ones I think who are from the 18th century. But we have what's unique to Savannah is we have a very large population of German Jews. To give you an example of how it worked, by the time Washington is elected, there are 3,000 Jews in America, most of them Sephardic Jews. By 1880, there are 250,000 Jews in America, almost all German. So you can see how the German Jews overwhelm the Sephardic Jews. You have 240,000 German Jews and to 10,000 Sephardic Jews. However, who is going to overwhelm the German Jews? The Eastern European Jews. So from 1881 to 1924, there's going to be 3 to 3.5 million Eastern European Jews who come in. So 3.5 million versus 250,000, you can see how they'd overwhelm. So that's why there's so few German Jews left in America, because percentage-wise, they just got overwhelmed by the Eastern European Jews. We, however, do have a bunch, unusually. In most congregations, you will have very few families that go back to pre-1850, and we have a lot of families. Bob, when did your family come into America? Are they German Jews?
Well, they were French German. They were from Lorraine, Alsace-Lorraine, and they came over in the late 1857s. They actually landed in New Orleans, and in New Orleans, there were so many Jews there. They asked them not to stay in New Orleans, so they got loaded on a boat, and they went to Alexandria, Louisiana, which is about 150 miles north. And they started a Jewish congregation there, about 20 Jews.
I actually interviewed for that position, half interviewed for that position.
Yeah.
So Bubba is one of the, I'm sorry, Genevieve?
How could they just say there's too many Jews, you have to leave?
Because it was the 1850s.
You could do that, yeah. Back then you could do that. And again, it may have not been a mean thing to do, because the mean thing to do would have been, let's kill you or send you out with shotguns. But basically, and Jews would do this as well to each other. You know, Bubba's family may come in and the Jewish community said, listen, we don't have enough jobs for you, but we have a job for you in Alexandria. If you want to go there and start a business, we'll fund you. And that happened a lot.
Well, my great grandfather and his two brothers, he was Myers, Isaac, and Moses. All were drafted into in 1861, drafted into the Confederate Army and all served.
And that is also very rare. Not rare that Jews served in the military, rare to have people today, because again, there's so few German Jews compared to the Ashkenazi. Like my family, all of them came over in the 1890s to I had one grandfather came over in 1930s, but almost every Jew in America who was born Jewish or descended from Jews, their families came over after the Tsar was assassinated in 1881. Ava, you're also different though, but you came over later. You came over after in the 1950s. Your family came here.
We came in 66.
Yeah, so in the 60s. So that's a rare. It's not rare in that it didn't happen. It's just compared to 3.5 million Jews coming over from Eastern Europe, everything else is small comparatively. So we have an inordinate number of Jews who would have come over before 1881, families in our congregation. And some of the traditions are really interesting because my family is Ashkenazic and my family's not religious, came over in the 1890s. However, what's the one thing that they would have never done in my family at all? Considered, and we weren't religious at all. I mean, we're members of the congregation. The one thing you did not do was name your children after someone who was living. That was like not even thought of. Whereas in Savannah, apparently the German Jews here, it became very popular. So even to this day, you can tell like Bubba's name, was your father the first Myers?
No, his grandfather was Myers.
So Bubba's the third Myers in his family. The president of our congregation who came right after him was Charles Harris, and he was named after his grandfather, Charles Harris, as well, or his son is Charles Harris. B.H. Levy's father and his son were B.H. Philip Solomon's father was Philip. David Bick's father was David. So you can tell pretty easily just by that. If you are naming your children after somebody who's living, you're probably not an Eastern European Jew, or at least you have some German ancestry, because it was not even thought of. You named your children after dead relatives, not living relatives. So it's really interesting how those traditions, even though I'm Ashkenazic, and Bubba's family's Ashkenazic, it's the difference between German and Eastern European. That's the most obvious difference in tradition. So Jews stayed here all the way and continued to be prominent. Of course, by the time German Jews started coming over, there was one field in Savannah, as with everywhere else, which became the most prominent field for Jews, and that is retail. Retail really became the place where Jews would go. They would go to smaller areas, especially where there was less competition and you had more connections. That's why there's so many retailers who were Jewish in Savannah. It's not any different than any other small Jewish town. My hometown, every single father just about was a merchant. They all owned stores downtown. Broughton Street used to be mostly Jewish merchants. MLK Street, which used to be West Broad Street, was all Jewish merchants because it was a field where there was no limitations. Most of the time you start off with a junk dealer and then end up somewhere else, Bubba's and liquor. That was another place that was not any place where there was no restrictions. That's where you go. There was still limits on how many Jews could be doctors and lawyers and professionals, but there was not really limits on retail. And so that's where most of the Jews went really until the last 2 generations. I mean, really, it's only in my lifetime and your lifetimes that Jews started to go into other fields on bulk because there was Bubba.
MLK Boulevard, which was West Broad and Broughton Street. Retail shops were on the bottom, and a lot, especially on MLK, and the many of the Jews, especially the Orthodox, lived above there. their businesses. The Orthodox synagogue, we got to remember, which now is SCAD building, was on the corner near Bay or Broughton and MLK over there. So a lot of them lived over there, and that was the community. Now, just a side note, before B.B. Jacob moved south side, if you go to the east side of Savannah off of Skidaway and like 38th, where near Bonaventure, where the cemetery is, all the streets there are named after Jews because there was a thought of putting B.B. Jacob there back in the 50s.
Oh, really? Is that why?
If you ride through there, there's a lot of Jewish names on the streets because a lot of Jews moved there thinking that this is where the Orthodox synagogue was going to go.
And then they had to sell their house and move somewhere else.
So
So
which SCAD building was it?
it's now the Student Affairs Center, isn't it right?
Something like that, but it's on MLK. It still has a Star of David on top.
And it has, I think, the Ten Commandments also in front. So if you go see it, they have to keep it that way because there's a rule downtown that you have to keep the outside exactly as it was. You can change the inside. So they've kept it. So if you go by it, you'll see it on the outside. I forgot where it is as well. So all three synagogues used to be downtown. And then, so.
Where was the third one?
The third one was off of Drain Street, close to what the big hotel there. What's it called? The
DeSoto?
on Drain by the park, by Forsyth Park. The
Oh, the mansion.
by the mansion. It was like a block away from that.
Okay.
And so what happened was, religiously, we kept one congregation with separate seating. We were a little bit more religious probably than many, but as happens in the 1860s, as Jewish tradition dictates, you have a split in the congregation for religious reasons. That's always the answer. The real reason is something usually different. The real reason, some wanted to be more traditional, some less traditional. The real reason is because the rabbi and the president of the congregation didn't get along. So the story I heard was the president told the rabbi not to come to a bris. He went to the bris, he got fired. He said, I'm going to start my own congregation. And he named it after himself. His name was Rabbi Jacobs, so he named it B'nai B'rith Jacobs. B'nai B'rith is a men's club, men's organization. So it's still called B'nai B'rith Jacob to this day. So in the 1860s, we had two Orthodox synagogues, but soon afterwards, Mikveh Israel decided to have mixed seating, men and women together, even though we were Orthodox. You could do that back then because everything wasn't so set like it is today. So we became an Orthodox synagogue with mixed seating. So we were more the liberal Orthodox synagogue, and BBJ was the traditional Orthodox synagogue. Then, of course, there's going to be a break off, I believe, from BBJ, and in 1904, AA is founded, Agud Achim, as the conservative synagogue, and then we become the Reform synagogue, and BBJ becomes the Orthodox synagogue. And that's how it is still to this day. I don't know if it was officially decided amongst the leaders of the congregations they were going to do this, or just everybody did it on their own. But the reason really AA becomes so important is because of this Eastern European immigration. Remember, you got all these Eastern European Jews coming into America, and they're overwhelming the German Jews who want to help. But a lot of the German Jews do not want these Eastern Europeans to be in their homes, their synagogues, their clubs, because they're like hillbilly cousins. These are the people who are coming from the shtetls, from the ghettos, like Fiddle on Roof. They don't know anything. They don't have any skills. They don't have any money. They don't speak the language. Very different than the German Jews who came over in the mid-1800s, who came from an educated society. These people knew Talmud, but nothing else. And so we wanted to integrate them, but not necessarily invite them into our homes. Now nobody cares. But back then it was a deal. Like if my daughter was a nice German Jewish, woman from a nice family, and then this Eastern European son from this family that's country bumpkins wants to marry my daughter, date my daughter, I'm going to probably say, you got to be kidding. Romeo and Juliet thing. But it did happen. So eventually the conservative movement becomes the main movement for these Eastern European Jews. So as you can imagine, the conservative movement becomes the largest movement in America because they're taking advantage of this Eastern European immigration. The Reform movement will become bigger in the 1970s. The Orthodox will not take, basically a lot of these Eastern European Jews did not want to be Orthodox. They had that in the East, back home, so they would become Orthodox maybe later, but most of them wanted to leave that behind because they wanted to be American and they wanted to do something really important in America, because if you wanted to succeed in America, you had to work on Saturday. There was just no way around it. So if you stayed Orthodox, you couldn't do that, and that was just not feasible if you wanted to be working in retail, even if you wanted to work in a sweatshop. If you wanted a job, you might be able to get off on Sunday, but you had to work on Saturday. I mean, unless you were in a very specific field. So that became the three synagogues to this day. Later, Bubba's uncle will found the Jewish Federation and Jewish Community Center in Savannah. I think a big reason was to help integrate the Eastern European Jews, I imagine. I imagine that was one of the reasons, because you have a lot of people coming in and they don't know how to do stuff. And what a lot of the Jews would do, both when new Jews came to the country, they would sponsor them in businesses or they'd have them work for them. And we were just talking about The Jew Store, which is a wonderful book about this. A Jewish guy from New York leaves New York, moves to Nashville, wants to get a job there. The Jewish men say, there's no room for a store here. We're going to sponsor you, though. If you go into the middle of this town, we'll sponsor you. You can start a store there and you can thrive because of merchandising, because you'll have access to more. He goes to the small town and he starts the Jew Store, a store where, and he fears the KKK, he fears anti-Semitism, and he finds none of it because everybody's excited that he is in town, because it's like a Walmart coming to town. You're getting access to stuff you never had before. So the local KKK leaders become his friend. He ends up saving the city during the Depression because, they came with skills. And the reason he was so successful is because, one, he had merchandising experience, and two, he had people in other places who would send him stuff. I don't know how that works. I'm not in merchandising or business, but I know the connections helped him. And that's what you had all over. So what you saw, like with the German Jews, a lot of them went to small towns. A lot of these Eastern European Jews ended up going to small towns like Savannah and helping to increase what was going on here. And so this is where the world, if you look at Jews today, most of them come from these Eastern European immigration. Very few Jews who were born Jewish or descended from Jews will not have at least one or two family members who came during this time. I have three out of my family, out of my grandparents' family. Three of them came from that side. So when it came to anti-Semitism, which is always the question, because there is a really interesting stereotype about how Jews are treated in the South. For some reason, the stereotype is that Jews were treated very poorly in the South. That is actually not true. It's actually quite the opposite. In smaller areas, especially, Jews were generally treated better. In areas where there are lots of Jews, they were often treated worse. Now in the South, because they were skilled, there was not as much anti-Semitism, and very little. A lot of people remember the bombing of and during the 60s and the hanging of in the 1920s. There were periods where Jews had struggles. Usually there were periods where, like, the KKK would become much bigger, like after the Civil War, after World War I, during the Civil Rights Movement. But generally speaking, Jews in the South fared really well. They tended to be skilled. They tended to have skills that other people didn't have, so they were not necessarily competing. And there weren't a lot of them. Like, you come to Savannah and you do have a couple thousand Jews, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to 300,000 in the county. So most of the time Jews were respected and appreciated. They weren't allowed to go to certain clubs. There was a country club right around the corner from us. Jews weren't allowed to. I think there was a supper club Jews weren't allowed to go into. But really, that is such a minor inconvenience compared to what was going on before. So again, you're an Eastern European Jew. You've lived in a shtetl where you were worried about pogroms, people coming in and killing you and stealing from you, forcing you to move, repressing you. And you come to America and you come to Savannah and you're working in a store. And what's the anti-Semitism? You can't join this country club. So you can see there wasn't, most Jews did not want to rock the boat. They were like, we're happy with this. I don't need to join this country club. I don't need to stay at this hotel. It's not really till the 60s and after World War II in the 50s that becomes an issue where we want full right. We're pretty happy having as much as we do. There was very few limitations. Jews couldn't be in certain fields like banking and advertising. There was a few fields where Jews really can't be in very much, but everything else was pretty open. And let me tell you, there were plenty of Jewish lawyers, and the medical field opened up very quickly all over the place. So Jews in Savannah have had a really good time for almost 300 years. There's been very little in terms of anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of opportunity. I think the fact that we were here from the very beginning and have been a consistent present throughout has made a huge difference as well. And so Savannah has been a very good place. We're no longer the largest Jewish population in America, not even close, but we remain very unique. And you see this when you go to national events, and our Jewish leaders, and people find out there's 4,000 Jews in a small town in Georgia with a population of 140,000 people. And we're not a suburb of a big city. The nearest big city is 4 hours away, or maybe 2 hours if you count Jacksonville or Charleston. And there's just not that many Jews in small southern towns like there are here. And certainly not with 3 synagogues, a Chabad, and a giant Jewish community center, which we call the JEA. So we're in many respects an anomaly, but we really have been since the beginning, Bubba.
The reason it's called the JEA is because that's what Rabbi George Solomon insisted. He wanted it a place for education of the Jews.
So did he get that name from somebody else, or did he invent it himself?
I don't know. It was around 1910 when they opened up the Jewish Center downtown. And also, I don't know if you know, but in the 1860s, the Harmony Club started, which was a Jewish organization for when the synagogue split. They said, well, we still need an organization. There wasn't a federation back there. So there was a club called the Harmony Club, which was still active up to 20 years ago, where Jews from both or all 3 of the congregations would get together for social events, because there wasn't a country club they could go to.
Right.
Because Savannah Inn was off limits. It wasn't till the mid to early 1900s that the Savannah Golf Club was open to Jews.
It's really interesting. When you talk about golf clubs, it's another irony, because around the country, Jews started their own golf clubs because they weren't allowed in others. How many Jewish golf clubs are there now? I think 0. Because
actually, David Foreman's dad was the president of one in Maryland.
They still may exist as clubs, but they're not purely Jewish. Yeah, because
except for Catholics, and no, just kidding.
We don't know. Yeah, because when you started a Jewish golf club, you'd start a golf club because you weren't allowed in the other golf clubs. Once they allow you in the other golf clubs, then you go to those, and the Jewish golf clubs falter unless they invite everybody else in as well, because you just can't compete with just one group of people.
So I heard a story, and I don't know, you guys can tell me if it's true or not, is that Armstrong wasn't allowed into the men's club over on Forsyth, on the corner of what is it, Bull and Gaston, I guess. And so he built his house right across the street as kind of a.
Oh, is that why he did it? Is that true, Bubba?
I don't know. I haven't heard that, but it could be. Could be. You got to realize that Savannah, the Jewish community lived, and so did the other religions, near their churches, near their places of worship. more than where they worked because they had to walk there. You know,
So
especially
I heard he built it across from the men's club as a stick it to you. Like now you can look at my big old house every time you go. I don't know.
And now,
Good.
now it's Kessler's home.
that is true. That's the Oglethorpe Club there you're talking about, right?
Which I think is now, but I've spoken there now a couple times. I speak there one at St. Patrick's Day. All right, so that's a little bit about Savannah. We'll probably do this again another time when we have a lot more people, but we are on YouTube. Next week, we will have a class. I think we're going to talk about the Jewish history of Charleston, which is interesting, but not as interesting as our history.
Yes, sir.
And we'll have a few more people because I think a lot of people went to the Ollie event today. So they'll join us next week. So you guys have a good one. Thanks again for joining us on the Wednesday class that shall not be named. And as for upcoming events, please remember April 24th, this Monday, 6:15, doors open. We have our Just event where we're going to support the idea of $2.5 million being put in the local low-income housing fund. And we're going to be pressing the school board to put to really start this reading program. So that is, and then as for other events, Truman's playing this Friday. We'll have a Just Lunch on Saturday. We have the Sisterhood Women's Service on Mother's Day coming up. We have a wine fundraiser coming up, and we have Shavuos study session movie we're going to watch, and I may get in trouble for this, but it's okay. We're going to watch History of the World Part 1, and we're going to talk about controversial moments in Jewish history. We're watching History of the World Part 1 because Mel Brooks just came out with History of the World Part 2, the miniseries, at age 96. He produced it.
Is that the movie where they have the soapbox philosopher?
Yes, I think it is.
You can't make that up.
Yeah, it's rated R, but I don't think there's any nudity. I may fast forward through the one. Huh?
I'm not watching it if there's no nudity.
Okay, then there will be.
Yeah.
Stay safe, everybody.